In this Shadow of the Erdtree video, I'm going to be showing you my Shadowblade build. This is a build that focuses on using the Smithscript Dagger, which is one of the Smithscript weapons that can be thrown and is a throwing blade, and it's the only throwing blade in the game, which means that all of its attacks actually throw its blades, whether you do a running attack, jumping attack, heavy attack, etc. All of them are going to throw this weapon. So there are some caveats with this weapon. First of all is that you're going to have very low damage. And the damage of this weapon is low, obviously, because you can attack at longer range than just about any weapon in the game, if not longer than any other weapon that's not like a bow or something like that, a melee weapon. And so you're going to have to attack more times to get more damage. And one of the things is, even though you have range, you're going to quickly realize you have a lot shorter range than you think you do. And a lot of times enemies move quickly and can close the distance on you while you're in the middle of a combo. So learning to use this at range can be very difficult, and in some cases you might realize that it's kind of a difficult weapon to use because even though it does have that range, you're still usually within striking distance of a lot of enemies, especially if you're trying to get maximum damage. However, there are some serious advantages to this weapon, which is, first of all, this weapon is dynamite on horseback. When you're riding around on horseback, you can just unload this weapon like boom, boom, boom into enemies, and you'll deal a lot of damage in a hurry. And even though each hit doesn't deal a ton of damage, the amount of overall damage that you do at safe range is fantastic. And I would urge you, if you like to play on horseback, to check out this weapon, because I feel like it's a lot more reliable than using a short bow or something like that in terms of what it can hit. And also, you know, try and fight bosses that you can fight on horseback. If you're using this weapon, fight them all on horseback. It's simply easier. It might take a little while longer than a regular fight, but it's going to be safer and easier. Piercing Throw is actually a fantastic weapon skill for this weapon too, because it gives you two things that you need, which is more damage and it gives you more range. So if you're trying to pick off that one difficult elite enemy and you don't want to get close to him, Piercing Throw is the way to go. And if you're like exploring methodically, slowly, you might want to slot Piercing Throw on here in order to be able to take out those tough enemies. The downside is that the damage isn't substantial for the FP cost. The upside is that you get a lot of range out of it, and it protects you from, you know, getting inside melee range and potentially getting hit by a deadly elite with one of their combos or something like that. And it also tends to make enemies flinch. So those guys that like fling spells at you, like a Fire Knight or something like that, tends to interrupt them so they can't get their spells off. Now, this weapon deals physical damage and has pretty good dexterity scaling. It has S and dexterity scaling when you're at the Keen infusion. So you can kind of set up this weapon in two ways, in my opinion. You either want to go full dex and take advantage of that S scaling and get as much damage per throw out of this as you can, or you go something like Blood Infusion and split your points between Dexterity and Arcane. Try and get as much damage as you can, even though it's going to be less than, you know, pure Dexterity, and try and really lean into the bleed aspect of throwing your weapon and triggering a bleed at range. And I would highly recommend, if you're going the Blood route, to use Scattershot Throw. Scattershot Throw is going to help with your blood loss buildup tremendously, and in a lot of cases you can trigger blood loss buildup with just a couple tosses of this. So if you went blood, absolutely use Scattershot Throw, particularly if you're fighting a difficult to fight enemy that's like large, like, you know, any boss that's huge. There are a lot of big bosses because each one of those daggers that goes into that boss is going to deal more damage and also trigger more blood loss buildup. So you're fighting something that's big, this is a great way to go. So you kind of need to decide which one of these you want to do. And sometimes if you have enough larval tears, you can just kind of go back and forth depending on what boss you're facing. I generally like the blood setup a little bit better. You're going to see more blood gameplay in here than the dexterity. But if you're kind of methodically working your way through like a legacy dungeon, I feel like Piercing Throw and dexterity is a better way to pick off elite enemies to keep you safe. Because Scattershot Throw, even though it can shotgun those things point blank, still puts you in close melee range, which you may not want to be. And Scattershot Throw, too, is good AoE, so there is a case for that. You can methodically work your way through dungeons with Scattershot Throw. I'm not saying that you can't, but I just feel like for the harder enemies, the ones that are more likely to kill you, Piercing Throw is a better option. And this is also a paired weapon, so if you are using this, you're going to want to dual wield it to get faster attacks with your weapon. Do not one-hand it, dual wield it. It's definitely the way to go. You're just going to get more damage. You're going to get your combos off, and if you're using talismans that allow you to increase your attack power with successive hits, you can build that up really, really quickly with this weapon from a modest distance. So on my offhand, I don't have anything, but you could use a Sacrificial Axe in order to give you FP with each kill. This would help offset some of the cost of either Piercing Throw or Scattershot Throw, whichever you want to use. I don't have it here because I'm trying to go light equip load, which gives me a further rolling distance, which allows me to dodge a lot better because our way of defending with this build is dodging and trying getting or spacing away from enemies, or get behind enemies and throw blades into them. I like that longer dodge roll. So I'm using the Shadow Militia armor kind of for the look here. It's kind of give us like ninja throwing knife kind of look. That's why I called it Shadowblade. But you can really use any armor that you want for this build. If you're going light equip load, obviously you want to wear something light. If you're going medium for more protection, make sure you're hitting at least 51 poise so you can throw blades and not get interrupted. But I kind of like the light load out. And the other thing is, too, if you want to use the Blue Dancer Charm for your Talisman to further boost your physical damage, which is good for this weapon because it's very light, you could wear something even lighter than I'm wearing now to get damage out of it. I would recommend not having a total equip load over about 16 if you want to use the Blue Dancer Charm, or in my opinion, there are just better talismans to use. So you want to make sure you're very, very light, much lighter than I am if you're going to use the Blue Dancer Charm. Talismans that I use for this build, first one is Shard of Alexander to boost Piercing Throw or Scattershot Throw. It's good on either of these, so this is kind of universal. You're going to want to leave this one. The Smithing Talisman is pretty much a must-have. This is going to boost your damage while using any weapon that you can throw effectively, and every one of your attacks is a throw, so all of your damage gets boosted with this. Even your weapon skill gets boosted with this, so you definitely want to use the Smithing Talisman. Beyond that, you can kind of mix it up. I have the Lord of Blood's Exaltation when I'm doing the bleed setup because I trigger bleed regularly, and it's very easy to trigger this, particularly if you use Scatter Shot Throw. Usually 1 or 2 throws of this will trigger it, and you can just run to the next enemy having that damage boost and kill them, and then re-up with Scatter Shot Throw when you need to. Crusade Insignia is also a good talisman for this because once you kill an enemy, you're going to get a damage boost for a time, and between that and Lord of Blood's Exaltation, you can keep your damage much higher. Just keep that up in between enemies if you're running through an area where there are a lot of enemies or a legacy dungeon. And, White Mask, if you want to use that with this build, is also not a bad armor piece to give you 10% more attack power when you trigger bleeding. If you're going the blood route, that's also a good piece to have, because between that and Lord of Blood's Exaltation, when you trigger bleeding, you gain that 30% attack power increase, and that's kind of offset some of that lower damage that the Blood Infusion has over the Dexterity Keen scaling. The Spear Talisman is also an option for this build since you tend to throw into enemies when they're attacking you a lot, particularly bosses, to get counter damage, and counter damage is boosted by the Spear Talisman. You're going to do a lot of counter damage with this build, and that will increase your counter damage. It won't be with all of your throws because enemies aren't always attacking or in their attack animation moving forward when you attack with your weapons, but it will boost your damage a lot of the time inadvertently. And obviously other good talismans are Millicent's Prothesis or Rotten Wing Sword Insignia because you build up your attack power quickly when dual wielding. Millicent's Prothesis is better if you're going the keen scaling route, and if you're not going this keen scaling route, you're going, blood route, Rotten Wing Sword Insignia is a good choice. And then lastly, I'll just say as well that you could use the Claw Talisman for jump attacks. I do jump throws sometimes. That can boost the damage of your jump throws. You could also use like Feathers armor, like Black Raptor's Feathers or the Gravebird's Feathers chest piece for further increased jump damage. I just find that I don't use jumping attacks all that much, so I don't need it. But if you find yourself really liking the jumping attacks of the weapon, consider adding either of those. Attribute-wise for this build is going to be a bit different depending on which one of these setups that you go, but I have 50 Vigor here. This should really be 60. I'm in light armor, it should be 60. I just don't have enough points at this level 156, so ideally this would be higher. If you go higher, you're going to want to increase your Vigor. I have both Mind and Endurance at 30, and this is because you need a good amount of FP to use your weapon skill regularly, or you're going to be chugging FP flasks constantly. And you need a good amount of stamina because you're just constantly attacking, rolling, using your weapon skill, and your stamina is going to drain really quickly because you literally just cannot attack enough with this build. So you need a good amount of stamina. This also helps us reach the light load if you want to be a light build so that you can roll more easily. Strength is at 8 because I couldn't get lower than that. You only need 5 for this build, so ideally you'd have 5, but I don't think there are any classes that have 5. You don't need any intelligence. Again, I was an astrologer, so disregard that. 11 faith is simply to meet the requirements for the weapon. This weapon doesn't have great faith scaling. So then on the blood setup, I have divided my points between dexterity and arcane. And the reason for that is what I noticed is that the attack power difference between going pure dexterity over pure arcane on this setup was about 11. So even though I lost 11 attack power, I gained about 12 blood buildup per throw. I wanted the blood buildup over that 11 attack power. I think that's a better trade in general. But you don't get a lot more blood buildup past this in Arcane. Like, if you go up to, like, 80 Arcane, I think you only get 3 more total blood loss buildup. So it's really not worth going over about 40, 45 Arcane if you're going to go the blood route. All your other points for damage should go into Dexterity. If you went Keen, obviously all your points are going to get dumped into Dexterity, and you don't need any Arcane at all, and you're just going to use your other stats to meet the requirements of the weapon. For Flask of Wonders Physique, I'm using the Opaline Hard tier and the Stamina Recovery tier. The Stamina Recovery is just important to help in fights, particularly boss fights, and Opaline helps with damage reduction because you're wearing light armor. If you went medium armor, you might need something else. You could also use the Thorny Crack tier for repeated attacks to build up your attack power, but I find I use my weapon skill a lot more in boss fights than normal attacks. So I don't build up my attack power as much as I think I do. And then finally, if you're talking about what great rune to use, Radahn's is my choice here because you need more stamina, you need more FP, you need more health. All these things are good. So I recommend using Radahn's. You could use Godric's, but I don't think you really need enough attribute. There's not enough attributes there to really justify it. It's like 5 or 6 out of 8. That's not very many in my opinion. You really want to have like 7 or 8 out of that in order to have that. So Radahn's is better in my opinion. So that wraps up my Shadowblade build. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. We have more builds coming, obviously. And if you have tips or suggestions, please leave them in the comments. And if you have a build you want to see I haven't asked in a while, please let me know in the comments below.